Hello my dudes, it's Grimdoc again, and I'm here to bring you guys some more amazing stories from the Forgotten Realms. Okay dudes, in today's episode I have a big one to talk about. This was almost as crazy as the Dawn War itself, my dudes, because the events that began from here made the empires of the Saruk, the Batrachi, and even the Aerie empires look like children's toys. I'm not joking around when I say this was insane, dudes. Like, guys, this was crazy. Before we begin this episode, we need to go back a little bit first, my dudes, because last time there was a race of winged elves that we didn't exactly talk about. So we're gonna start by talking about them, their history, and how these guys started out. Now, these guys were called the Winged Folk, or Avariel. In Elven, they would be called the Errol Tel Kesir. And these were among the first of the elven races to migrate to Faerun. Now you guys know we've been talking about the Aerie a lot during these last few videos. Well, the Avariel got along with them very well. Anyways, the Avariel used sign language that they designed to communicate, and this was designed around movement with flying. So flaps, stalls, and wind dips to communicate from a distance with each other. Pretty interesting stuff there. However, these guys were almost wiped out to absolute extinction, even to the point to where in modern D&D, even the sight of one is considered to be a myth and a legend, and we're going to talk about that crazy event right now. Okay guys, today we're going to talk about dragons. That's right, we're finally hitting the big leagues, my guys, and let me tell you, these dragons of the ancient age were no joke. And by the way, guys, we're leaving the Age of Thunder behind. From here, we're going to be entering the ancient days of the Dawn Age. Now we're negative 30,000 DR, and from here we gotta talk about the rise of dragons, my dudes, and the fall of the Winged Folk empires, and the time of dragons. This is Dungeons & Dragons after all, my dudes. Anyways, so 400 years after the Mirashi's wasting plague decimated the Aerie core, the dragons all over the lands of Toril got together. And I mean like all of them. They all simultaneously got together and began a massive assault against the Aerie empires, bringing them to absolute ruin and decimating their empires for good. Okay, so now before we talk about how all of this stuff went down, we gotta talk about the big capital center of the Aerie empires. Basically the ancient Rome of the Birdmen. Now this place was called Viaku. Now where this place was fully located in modern D&D isn't exactly well known, but it is known that the Avariel and other bird people would visit to do basic trading and other modernized things around this era. Okay, so some of you guys are probably out there thinking, well, this place was wiped out, but where exactly was it? And here's a fun fact. There was another Aerie Empire capital city called Fiukri, and it was located where the star mounts are located in modern D&D. Well, Viaku was southwest of that area. So if you're running an ancient campaign while playing a classic D&D run, take a peek southwest of that area. You might run into some ancient ruins. Anyways, now we're going to talk about the first flight of the dragons. And a lot of sources refer to this crazy event as the Draco Rage, or the Rage of Dragons. And at this time, dragons went absolutely crazy and started rampaging everywhere, destroying everything in their way. Here's the thing, however. There is some convoluted information surrounding this, because the event of the first recorded Draco Rage wasn't until negative 25,000 DR. And this was created by the Elves, and they called it the Draco Rage Mythal, which we'll cover later in a future video. So whether or not this was considered an official Draco Rage or a Draco Rage at all isn't exactly set in stone, but I still felt like it's important to talk about this here because, well, we'll later be referencing this later on in a future episode. Either way, dudes, the dragons officially eradicated the empires of the Aerie around this time. Around the same time, during the first flight of the dragons, one of the dragon generals of Tiamat, remember Bahamut's other part from episode 3, Anyways, the dragon general of Tiamat was called Nagamat, and he was in charge of laying siege to the airy kingdom of Shara. Leading an army there, he destroyed the hatcheries in this kingdom and eventually claimed this realm as his own. Later on, he would be drawn as some of the religious conflicts at that time period, which would spark something that they called the Dragonfall War, which we're going to end up covering in a future video. We'll talk about this some more later on, but for now, it's time to talk about another war that had begun in the world of Toril at this time period. So, with the chaos surrounding the first flight of the dragons going on, there was another big issue going on in the world with the gods. And this is the start of where we're going to cover the War of the Seldarine, which is Elvish for Fellowship of Brothers and Sisters of the Wood. And this was the elven pantheon of gods, and their big debut into the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons. Mind you, they were around even during the Days of Thunder, but not as prominent and didn't exactly show up very often at all. Okay dudes, it's time to talk about the elves now, and I know some of you guys are excited to hear about the fair folk of the ancient ages. Now, before we dive into this, we need to talk about the big god of the elves, called Corellon, who would later be called by many as creator of the elves, and also by the Protector. So we've talked about how there's this whole plethora of different dimensions and stuff basically linked to Toril, and one of them was the plane of the fairy. Well, Corellon was actually from the realm of Arvindor, which most consider to be the first layer to the outer plane of Arborea, and many consider it as the Divine Realm. If anything, this place can be considered as the Divine Realm. Anyways, let's go back to the elves and talk about them for a moment. The first of the elves to arrive to Toril were known as the Green Elves, the Lythari, and the Avariel. Remember earlier we talked about the elves with wings? Anyways, what happened with the second wave of elvish folk were the Dark Elves, who arrived in the jungles of southern Faerun, closer to the regions of the Chult, and then you have the Sun and Moon Elves, which arrived in the far north. Anyways guys, there's so many types of elves that we'll have to cover them all in a later episode, which will then cover the aquatic elves too. Whatever the case, let's backstep for a second because we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So, with the Dawn Age happening, the elves finally came out of the woodwork because of the Seldarine. And the end result of this event was one of the gods called Oroshni was banished to the Demon Web Pits, which is one of the layers of hell, and she would be later known as Lolth. And we'll talk about why she was banished here in a moment. And I'm certain a lot of you dudes know about her if you're fans of the Drow of the Underdark, because that would be their big god. Now, listen up dudes, we're going to step to the side for a second and talk about some of the Celestials that were hanging around during this time, called the Solar. Now, as you dudes know, this is Dungeons & Dragons, but there's also angels that existed around this ancient time too. Crazy that there's so much in the world already, right? Anyways, the most powerful of the angels were called the Solar, and only a celestial paragon, which we'll talk about later on, was known to be more powerful than them. One of the Solars was called Malkazid. Now, Malkazid was a pretty hateful guy, because he was once seduced into betraying Corellon, remember the creator of the elves we talked about earlier? Well, he was tricked and seduced into betraying Corellon by Lolth. Because of him trying to seduce Corellon, Corellon banished him into the 9 Hells from the realm of Arvindor. He would grow to absolutely hate and despise them because of this, because it was honestly a bit of an extreme move even by Corellon standards. Remember dudes, the gods can get pretty petty sometimes. So with this chaotic period going on, let's talk about how all of this stuff went down. Oroshni, remember she's also called Lolth, decided to get her son called Veyran, and gathered a host of all sorts of evil deities and gods that opposed the Seldarine, and they attacked the realm of Arvindor in a gigantic battle in an attempt to overthrow Corellon. And this eventually failed, which is what led to her being banished into the 9 Hells by Corellon in the first place. And dudes, we'll cover this entire war in the next video, so I hope you're all ready. Anyways guys, that's going to be it for right now. In episode 10, we're going to cover the entire history of the Seldarine War and all that went down, but I gave you the simple version in today's episode. Also, just a heads up on the Seldarine War, none of this stuff is recorded in modern texts in modern D&D, so none of it has been recorded, so it's kind of like speculation, but mostly pulled from the internet sources and things like that. Anyways, guys, we've hit over 650 subscribers. Holy jeez, I wasn't thinking I'd be making videos as much, but I keep getting from you guys, just keeps me pushing on. Whatever the case, I hope you're all ready for a very long episode soon, because we're hitting the big teens now. Anyways, guys, this is Grimdoc the Lore Master, signing out.